getting it ready for spring. This is a little bit of a redux of a webinar that we hosted just with MassBike a few weeks ago when it was actually snowing, like actively snowing while the event was going on. So we were talking a little bit more about how do you deal with the slush, the snow, the ice, and all that, which has some particular challenges to it when you're considering riding in all seasons. I'm going to focus the next 45 minutes or so generally on how to awaken your bike. How do you think about, let's get that bike sprouting again and getting it up and riding. So we're going to focus on, maybe it's been a while since the bike's come out of the garage, maybe it's still in your basement, the very basics about getting your bike up and going. I've invited you down to my bike room, which is really my laundry room, because I want to limit a little bit about what I'm capable of doing, because I think most of you probably don't live in a bike shop. You might not even have a bike stand. So I'm going to try to do most of what I'm doing here with the very basics. There is a lot of nuances to cleaning a bike depending on what bike you are using. So I also have a few other bikes off screen that I'll pull in to demonstrate the nuances of types of handlebars, types of brakes, type of cabling, types of shifting, etc. But for the most part, we're going to try to cover what matters for most of everybody. Everybody's got wheels that need to spin. Everybody's got a chain that needs to go. Everybody's got brakes that need to function. Some of you might have gears. We'll cover some of this stuff. And I'm basing a lot of this off of my, I guess we're going on 18 years that I've lived in New England and been riding throughout the winters and had to awaken a bike. And I've made so many mistakes in those 18 years. So I'm basing a lot of this curriculum on things that I've done that I shouldn't have. But it's not the be all end all of what we're going to be talking about. So the last part of my preamble is to say, you've got more information than I do. So this can be collaborative. This should be collaborative. Anything that I'm missing or any nuances that you want to add, please populate it in the chat or follow up with us after the fact. We'll shoot our emails in the chat, and you can always follow up with Lauren and myself, and we're happy to engage. And then I'll ask Jess and Michelle if you want to keep an eye on the chat, just to tag me out at any time. Happy to take a pause. Happy to take a drink from my water bottle, because I am over caffeinated and I want to get through a lot in the time that we've allotted here. And we're hopefully going to round out and try to round this out by 5:30 so that we can do a little Q&A as well. And I'm happy to stick around, and I'm grateful that you are all not just interested in biking, getting it going, but you are spending your time with Ciclismo and MassBike. And thanks so much for spending your Friday with us. And again, shout out to Ciclismo. You guys do great work. I've never actually gone on an Italian tour yet. So that's
not yet.
My bucket list.
Yeah. Thank you, Galen. We love you guys too.
Excellent. Cool. So again, welcome to my bike room. It's really my laundry room. We're going to keep it really easy. The stuff we're going to be using today. So let's start with the prep materials. First off, the body. So I'm in a black t-shirt. This is my ride for Rick Archer. Unfortunately, this is a ghost bike memorial to a gentleman who was killed 4 years ago in the Back Bay. But secondary to the advocacy, I like to always do my bike work in a dark colored shirt, because we all know that black shirts don't get dirty, or you're going to get some grease on it. So find yourself in a situation that, like, it's okay to get a little bit greasy. You're going to want to get to know your bike. If you wanted to go so far as to get like a little apron or like a little work shot, you can go ahead and do that. I'm not going to do this for the sake of it might get caught on my headphones and limit it, but just make sure that you personally are okay with what you're about to dive into. Secondly, the space. So I've got my wonderful winter bike here, and I'll show you some of the rust with my close-up camera in a moment. But I also recommend finding a tarp or a rag, a piece of cardboard or something that you can throw under the bike. So you can see I'm just kind of putting this on the ground, and I'll put this over my bike because I am going to splatter a little bit, especially as we go through the greasing and the washing. So find a spot that maybe it's in your garage, maybe it's in your backyard, that it's okay if you get a little bit of grease on the floor. So that's the prep. But besides that, just be ready. You can use a rack if you want. I might use it, I might not. In my last lesson, I didn't, because I don't want to assume that you have a rack where you can put a bike stand up. But it does help facilitate turning of the pedals, moving the gears, and moving the chain. So we'll get into that in a minute as well. Cool. Looks like I'm seeing, yep, cool. Thanks for Jess and Michelle. You are on it. Great. Body, space, bike. Let's talk about the materials that we're going to use today. So we're going to cover what I like to call the ABCs, air, brakes, and chain, but that's generally what I like to do for all of my bike mechanicry. We'll dive into the ABC check to start. But before we do, what materials might you want to have handy? Again, very basics. You can always go above and beyond what we're going to do here today. So first off, you're going to want a rag. You're going to want something that is a, could be a throwaway. You're going to get it greasy. You're going to get it dirty. I like to use old Bike Month t-shirts because when you go to a Bike Month event, they always hand out free t-shirts. And I have drawers full of Bike Month t-shirts. So I like to use these as rags. This is going to be my rag of the day. A little tip there. If you do go to a Bike Month event, get the extra, extra large because that just means you get more rags. And you can always cut it up. So you're going to need a rag. You're going to need something to clean the bike with. I like to call it a degreaser. So the categories to think about is the wiping down, the degreasing, and the lubrication. Those are the three buckets that we're going to be dealing with today. For degreasing, I'm just basically going to use, this is called Green Fizz. It's a Pedros brand. Pedros, I believe they're still up in Haverhill, but it's a localish Massachusetts. They're great. They do lubrications. They do stands. They do tools. I like Pedros. They're good guys. They're local. But I like to use this as this Green Fizz. If you don't want to go so far to a bike shop to buy specific bike cleaning materials, this is also secondary. You can use the same old Simple Green that you've got going, that you clean at your house. You might want to dilute it down a little bit, maybe put some water in it. You don't want anything too abrasive for your bike because you love your bike and you want to make sure that you're treating it kindly. So if you're going to use something like a Green Fizz and Simple Green, you can also add some water. But I like this Green Fizz because it is made for bikes. It's also biodegradable. So I feel okay about using it in the planet. But again, to each their own, but you're going to need something that is a degreasing cleaning agent. Secondarily to that, you can use an actual degreaser. This is a heavier duty stuff. This is like the orange peels. This is something that you're going to have to like really get at to scrub off that thick grease that gets caught in the cogs and in the chain. If you want to go so far, I think this is a second tier need, and I'm probably not going to use it today, mainly because this requires a little bit more of a, you degrease, get that crud off, then you have to wash it, essentially get the degreaser off, and then you generally have to reapply lubricant on the things that need lubrication, because if you only use degreaser, you end up cleaning out the grit, but you don't put any lubrication in its place. So that becomes an issue, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about cleaning the chain. But this is in my degreasing bucket. These two will get you pretty far. Doesn't have to be bike specific, doesn't have to be Pedros, but just so you know, your bike shop is there for you and they sell all these products, and your local bike shop is probably also your best go-to to figure out how your bike can really get going. I'm looking at some chat, 7th generation stuff. Yeah, anything really that is like a light solvent, something that will break apart grit. Mainly that grit is oils combined with little shavings of metal and little road grit. So it's like a little bit of sand and stone and grime mixed in with metal shavings, mixed in with junk. Yeah, and Lauren's also mentioning a bucket. I don't use a bucket, but that's a really good point. If you really wanted to like soap stuff off, I won't do it here just because I'm limiting in my space, but if I was outdoors in my backyard, I probably would have like a big old bucket that was full of some foamy stuff to really get at my bike. So that's the solvent. One more solvent that I'll mention too before I forget is rubbing alcohol. Now, rubbing alcohol is key for cleaning off your brakes, specifically for the brakes because this evaporates without leaving any residue. This is 91 proof, which means it evaporates pretty quickly. You can get 70 proof, you can get 60 proof, whatever it is, as long as it's just isopropyl. The beauty of this is that you can clean off your rims of your bike or your brake pads without leaving a grit. And if you have disc brakes, you want only to use rubbing alcohol for those rotors. Because again, it doesn't have any sort of film that it leaves, like the Simple Green and the degreaser will actually leave a small degreasing coating. If that coating gets on your disc brake pads, you need to replace the pads. There's no solving it. So the only thing you should really think about with brakes, ideally, is rubbing alcohol. Unfortunately, I don't have my disc brake bike here. It's actually at the bike shop getting its spring tune up. So the other way to say this is that if you want to like also give your bike to a bike shop for a couple of weeks and let them do the whole overhaul in the spring. I do that for my nicer touring bikes and road bikes too. So that's also a secondary suggestion of like, do the basics that we'll teach you today. But if you really want to, go at it, my bike shop, they've got my bike. I'm getting new cables. I'm getting a new chain. I'm getting new gears. It's going to be beautiful when I get it, and I don't have to do anything. But that said, we're going to talk about today what you are responsible for, which is cleaning your bike, maybe not necessarily the whole overhaul. So again, degreasing solvents, green fizz, simple green stuff, some of the harder core degreaser stuff, and then a little regular old cheapo bottle of rubbing alcohol goes a long way. Okay, and then lastly, we're going to think about the lubrication. So this is key, especially with the rotational systems. I'll talk about that in a little bit. You're going to want to have stuff to grease things up that need grease. Actually, full disclosure, not a lot of your bike or the moving car parts actually need to be greased, but the stuff that does need to be greased needs to be greased well and clean. Specifically the chain, a little bit of, you're thinking about seat post, you want to check the rotational systems, which we'll do in a minute, but mainly around the drivetrain, which is the gear and the cogs and the chain, you're going to need a grease. So I've got a couple of options here. One is just a regular old drip. Another Pedro's brand is called Enduro. This is a relatively thin lubricant, and this goes on the chain, but it can also be used for cabling. This is a really nifty little guy right here. Again, it's a thin, like feels like even thinner than olive oil. This is what would be known as a dry lube, used for dry conditions. And similarly with thicker lubes, you can see at the bottom of this, there's actually a wax base. This is a lubricant called Rock and Roll. And this is a thicker lubricant made for wet conditions. And in order to use it, I kind of want to get that waxy substance to be dispersed throughout. And then I've got myself a nice thicker lube. This is great because it lasts longer in wet conditions. When you're riding in the rain, riding in the snow melt, riding in something that's got water coming through, it will break down the oils, it will break down the lubricants. So something thin needs to be replaced more frequently. Something thicker lasts longer. However, the thicker stuff also can attract some grit and grime. So if you let your thicker lube sit, it might actually start to get goopy and might start to actually kind of do a detriment to your bike by being a magnet for all the crud. So it's a little bit of a pro and con depending on where you are as a person. If you're a type B person, which is just like, let me just put it on, and then when I need to, I'll just put it on again, and like that's kind of like me. I don't really like to think about it too much. I'll generally use this when I'm doing my lubrication because it's just my catch-all, my go-to overall. If I want to be more specific, or if I'm going to be riding in like the sleety crud that sometimes March produces, I'll probably use a little bit of a thicker one, knowing that it just does a little bit of a job differently. And then lastly, with my lubrication, I'm also going to recommend you get a spray version of a lubricant. And this is actually very particular. This could be used for chains, but I'll show you how I'm going to use this on my cabling as well. And this is a really good thing to do, especially if you have drop bars that have integrated brakes and shifters. Something with a little hose to it really gets into where you need it to get into. So this is a really handy one as well. So spray lubes, thicker lubes, thinner lubes. I'm running the gamut today. That's kind of where I'm at. I'll take a quick pause while I set up my second camera, but if there's anything else to jump in, Lauren, Jess, and Michelle, please feel free.
So, yeah, I'm just going to, Jess, I want to just make sure, because we're going to be sending out tomorrow a follow-up email with the links for the donations to MassBike. And also, it'd be great to have a list of these items. Maybe is that possible, Jess? Just pop me an email and I'll prepare the email. So we'll just send you So look in your inbox tomorrow, and we'll send you a follow-up email to everybody that registered and is present today.
Excellent. Thanks, Lauren. Cool.
Now, one question too is, I guess washing the frame, you use just dish soap.
Yeah, dish soap can work. That's kind of what I use the green fizz for as well, or something that's like a light solvent. So I should have mentioned, this is really good for cleaning the grit off, a little bit of the derailleur if you need to, but more I use it for the frame itself.
Okay.
And I'll showcase that a little bit. I try to avoid this generally on my drivetrain. And again, the thing about a degreasing agent is that it's only one step of the process. If you need something to be lubricated, then you have to kind of put lubrication on afterwards. You have to grease it up afterwards. So I like to do things in as few steps as possible. If I were going to clean off my gears with this, I would then need to make sure that it's washed off, and then I'm going to re-lubricate my chain to make sure that the green fizz is not getting into my chain and preventing the actual lubrication from doing its job. So you could use dish soap as well. That's a really good call, Lauren. You know, a small squirt of dish soap in a warm water bucket actually does the exact same thing as green fizz, just the same.
Great.
Cool. And then if you want to go so far, I'll put on some gloves and then I'll dive right in.
If you were to wash your bike outside like they do like in a bike race, where we do in our fleet, when our bikes come back from our trips, we put them on one of those stands and we do that process that you said, but then we just do we wash it with a hose, a spray hose to kind of clean it. Yeah. I'm
glad you mentioned that. So I'm going to,
because you're doing an inside job now, but you're not going to have a spray hose, right?
Well, for the sake of efficiency, if you're at a cyclocross race or if you've got a bunch of bikes as part of a fleet that's really muddy, a hose is great because you can just get it done. My caution with a hose, though, and I'll bring this up a little bit later too, is that if you're using force in the spray, you can actually get the grit inside of the componentry. So I'm going to actually recommend, if you've got the time, you get a little watering can. And this is what I use generally with some warm water. And because I'll just pour it and use my rag to wipe it, it's low pressure, low abrasion. It does not really allow the salt water to get inside of my frame. Full disclosure, I've destroyed a couple of steel frames by riding them in the wintertime because the salt water just gets into those little holes in the bottom bracket or in the chainstay, and then the rust just eats it out. So the caution of a hose is if you're going to use a hose, I know it's really fun at a cyclocross race to just like hose it all down and just get all that mud off. But you run the risk of kind of getting little particles inside of that fine componentry, wearing down the springs of the derailleur prematurely, and even getting into the cabling system to make it rust a little easier. So if you're a patient person, a watering can is preferred.
Yeah, or like when you come back from a ride, you use your water bottle to kind of do a quick rinse.
Great. Yeah, that's a great call too. Yeah, just like a little spray down.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Interest of time, let's diagnose the bike and then we'll dive right in. So we'll keep this camera, and then Jess, I'll ask you to use my phone camera in a second as well. So we're going to do side by side, which is still new to us, so bear with us. Let's talk about the assessment of this bike. So this is a winter bike that actually was ridden throughout the winter, and you'll see what to really watch out for. Jess, can you check out my phone camera here as well, and we'll see if we can get some close-ups. If we do this side by side, let's see if we can get a technology on our side. Cool. How cool is this, right?
Oh, that's great.
Okay. So main thing I'm looking for is, where is there rust? And where is there rust means that that's where the salt and the salt water throughout the whole winter has been coming in. So primarily, and we'll do like a quick inspection, you can see that, maybe I can get it like this. Like, look how rusty that chain is. Maybe a little hard to see with my camera here. Again, thanks for bearing with us. You get a sense of a lot of orange. You see that? Does your chain look like this? Has your chain ever really looked like this? This is a sign of a bike that has been abused. And I'll talk about what else is going on here, but you'll also see there's a lot of chain slack. So I can actually take this chain and kind of give it some wiggle. And the reason that there's a lot of chain slack is because it's actually being worn out. The inside of the chain is being eaten away by rust. And also as it moves, there's a lot of friction going on. The pins, the rollers, and the plates of the chain are actually being worn down. And so there's less integrity of the chain, which means there's less structural strength, which is how you get a lot of chain. And I zoom out a little bit. You can see that there's a lot of slack going on. On a single speed, this is actually a problem because if there's so much slack that the chain ever hops off of that rear cog, you've lost all of your resistance, you've lost your ability to pedal, and if you're in the middle of an intersection, you're pretty much SOL. So you've got to make sure that your chain has good strength to it. There are ways of solving this. If you do get so bad and so wiggly like this, you can, on a single speed, you can kind of loosen these bolts and scoot the chain back a little bit. But you'll get to a point where the chain has lost so much integrity that it could actually snap on you. So that's something that we're going to pay attention to and how to avoid that. But the first thing I'm looking at is how rusty is this chain? And the answer is super rusty. Second thing I'm going to look at is the brakes and the brakes themselves. So I'm going to go up a little bit here, see if I can do this on the brake pads. It's a little hard to see, but if I can kind of get like a little bit of a top angle, see if I can do that. You want to see the rubber on the brake pads, and you want to have about maybe I'd say a centimeter or so of pad left, and it's going to be a little hard to see. I can get my light up here like that. Is that a little bit better? You can kind of get the sense of the rubber. So check out the brakes themselves. So we're starting with the chain, and then we're going to move to the brakes. And the idea here is how much rubber do you have? And we'll talk today about kind of cleaning off the brake pads as we get to it. And I might use a secondary bike. It'll be quicker for me to take the wheel off because that might be required. And then along with the brakes, how is the cabling system? So looking here at where the cable comes in, this bike is actually a vulnerable design because you can see how the brake cable comes in and activates. It's got an open top. So water throughout the whole season has been dripping through the cable and going into the housing and dissolving the grease that is inherently in the housing. So the housing itself can have gaps in it because the grease has been eaten away. And that gap can be filled with water. That water attracts rust. And that means that the cabling system here actually doesn't have good flow. And if it was really cold out, which has happened to me several times this winter, it can actually freeze and it prevents your cable from flowing. So for those of you who have cable activated brakes like I do on this bike, you want to make sure that the cable as it's vulnerable here is fairly protected. And we'll get into that in a minute as well. I'll also pay attention to the rubber on the tires. I'm not going to dive into it too much because that's kind of a whole other webinar of 90 minutes on how to change your own tire. But if you want to take a look at the sidewalls of your tires, look for any cracks, look for any bulges, look for anything on both of your wheels, inspect your tires regularly. Over the course of a winter, you're going to be riding through a lot of rock salts. You're going to be riding through a lot of sand. You're going to ride through a lot of debris because the street sweepers haven't been out since October. So you're just riding through all of the crud, all of the bits of metal, all the stuff that comes from the car traffic, all the stuff that's just generally on the side of the road. It starts to embed itself onto the rubber of the tires. And it can also get little microfine particles into the rim so that every time you're hitting the brakes with the brake pad, you're actually kind of crushing that gunk into the pad, destroying your rim, destroying your brake pad. And over time, if you don't clean that off, you can prematurely destroy your wheel. And full disclosure, I've worn down a wheel where my rims became so compromised, I had to trash the whole wheel. So don't be like Galen. Do a better job of making sure that your rims and your brake pads are cleaned off. This is a long-winded way of saying that your bike gets destroyed, but that's okay. In a bike shop, or generally in bike mechanics, we call those consumable parts. Those are the parts of the bike that get worn out and need to be replaced. Don't be surprised if you need a new chain in the spring. Don't be surprised if you need a new wheel every couple of years. Don't be surprised if you go through a couple of tires in a season of riding. That means you're riding your bike, you get a high five. If you have had a bike for 10 years and you've never replaced any of this stuff and it's all working okay, you are not riding your bike enough. It's okay. Your bike will slowly fall apart. You just got to keep an eye on it and start to replace those parts before they fail on you. It's a joke, but I like to say the only thing that's not replaceable on a bike is a frame. Everything else could at some point be replaced and changed. But that said, what we're going to be paying attention to today again are the chain, so that's the most vulnerable, the pads, the brake pads, and the rim system of the braking, the cabling itself, and then to keep an eye on the tires. And then besides that, the frame itself, you'll see, depending if you have a steel frame or an aluminum frame, you got to keep a special eye on it. This is a steel frame. See if I can get a little close. You can see some rust marks on the frame itself. I don't mean to show this bike as my, oh, pity me bike. This is my winter bike. This is my bike that's made to be destroyed so that I don't destroy my good bike when I'm riding in the winter. And it's okay to have a little bit of rust. This bike I got for free from Boston University because some student left it after a semester and whatever. There's free bikes all over the place. Or spend $100 on Craigslist getting a good quality mountain bike from the 90s, turn it into your winter bike if you want to go that route, and that's okay. However, we're going to talk about how we can bring these bikes back to life because we all love every bike that we have. So that's a little bit of my preamble, what we're going to cover today of cleaning the chain, checking the pads, checking the rims, checking the tires, and giving a good eye to the frame using the cleaning agents, the degreasing agents, and the rag and the water. Cool. I'm going to dive into the chain in a second, but before I do, I'll take a quick pause. Is there anything else to bring up, Lauren, Jess, or Michelle? Cool. Cool. Excellent. Great. So let's talk about the chain. Here's my wooden chain. This is my favorite educational tool because it really demonstrates the inner workings of a chain and the mechanicalness of what's going on with every little rotation that happens down here. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of rotations, hundreds of thousands of your chain bending and moving like this. It's a really fine-tuned piece of equipment, but yet it's pretty basic, pretty cheap. Highest quality chain is only like 30 or 40 bucks, and you replace it every year or two. Like it's fine. So the idea here is I want you to understand actually the components of the chain so that you're doing your due diligence of keeping it good and solid. And in the meantime, I'll kind of put my secondary camera close to my chain so you can get an idea of bad chain habits, of things to avoid. Sorry, this is a new device that I'm trying to play with here. Let's see if I can get this. Let's go all the way down to look at how bad this chain is. Sorry for a little bit of slapstick for you folks. Cool. All right, so I'll use this really rusty chain as my example of what to watch out for. All right, this chain is the exact same as your chain. All chains are universal. They all function the same. They're all the same. Links are all the same measurements. It's all universal. It just depends on the quality of steel. And the more expensive chains have higher quality steel and they can actually be a little bit lighter if you're so inclined. But regardless, the only thing you really have to worry about with replacing a chain is making sure it fits the gearing that you have. Chains from length of each link are be universal, but the width of the plates will change depending on how many gears you have. A single speed chain can be thicker. An 11-speed chain needs to be really thin because it's going through all the gears in the rear. But how all chains are made. So you have an outer link and you have an inner link and they rotate. And inside of that rotation, how that flows is you'll have a roller. You have a little bit of a roller that slides here. And the way that the links hold together is through a pin. Slide the pin out. Here's my pin. I have my outer link, right? And then I have my inner link. Inside of the links, you have these rollers, and these rollers actually flow and turn and rotate. If you've never taken apart a chain, this might be new to you, or if you take apart a chain all the time, this is definitely something you're familiar with. But I want you to think about when you're riding and you're going through all the grit and all the grime, all the stuff that collects, all the stuff that can get attracted and get caught inside of where the rollers meet the plate. And then when the plates go together, how that stuff gets trapped in there. And you can imagine that sandy salt water that we're riding through in March gets seeped through and gets stuck in the chain. And then as the chain goes in and goes back together with the pin, and again, I'm trying to do this in mirror, so bear with me here. That is how the chain is made mechanically. And boom, that's the chain link. Easy peasy, right? What we want to be cautious about. The problem with the chain is that once stuff gets in, it starts to rust away and starts to get grit in there, and that causes friction. The friction will actually wear away and eat away the inside of the chain. So the rollers start to hollow out. The pin itself will start to get pitted. And if you've got a really worn out chain, if you pull a pin out of a chain, you'll see two little indents there, which basically means the chain is getting pulled and worn away. And chains will eat themselves. When you are cleaning a chain and getting grit off, which I'll show you in a second, you're actually dissolving some of that metal that's been frayed and kind of collects inside of the chain. And you need to flush that out. You need to get that out of the chain. And the reason is if you let it sit in there with all that turn and all that rotation, the friction will start to destroy your chain. And that's why your chain gets really wiggly, because it just doesn't have the structural integrity anymore, because the more that the chain is worn away on the inside, the more it can flex and the more it can bend. You don't really want your chain to flex that much. There is an incredible amount of wattage that these chain links are responsible for translating from the gears all the way to the rear wheel. And if your chain becomes weak, if it loses its structural integrity, it can snap. It's hard to see, but in your own home, raise your hand if you've ever snapped your chain before while riding. Usually it's when you're putting a lot of force on it. Usually you're like powering up a hill or like sprinting to the town line. And if you snap your chain, you lose your resistance, and all that force and power could cause you to throw yourself forward off the bike, and you might crash. You lose control if you don't have resistance and be able to control your bike. So this is actually a safety concern as well, not just a rust concern. So I want to kind of make sure that we're all clear on this. And the reason I put a lot of time on this, the front load of this is so important to keep ready. So the way that you clean your chain to make it not so like this rust here, but can actually get it out, it can be done in a few step process. I'm going to do it in a 4-step process, but it really could also be a 5 or 6-step process. The first step is, what causes a chain to skip? Great question. As a chain wears out as well, it also causes a wear down of the cogs. So the more the wiggly the chain, the more friction it's putting on the teeth of the cogs, and the cogs themselves will wear away. It's a little hard to see, but you can see that these cogs are actually pretty sharp. Cogs shouldn't be sharp. The teeth here really, when they're new, are almost squared off, and they kind of become more and more shark finned as they wear down. The more wiggle from the chain, because the chain starts to wear out, the more wiggle and friction happens on each of these teeth, the more they start to wear down, the more gaps happen between the cogs, teeth, and the chain itself, which causes more wiggle, which causes more friction, which causes more wear, and the whole system starts to break down. It is true on the front and the back, just the same. So depending on what type of bike that you have, depending on how hard you ride, depending on how hard you clean it, they might not wear exactly the same, but they do wear as a system. So as the chain starts to wiggle itself to pieces, eventually it'll start to wear down the teeth. And if you ever see it really shark fin like this, if you're just replacing the chain, it might not be the wisest, because you might also need to replace these cogs as well if they start to get too sharp. Your local bike shop will tell you if it's a question as to what they might recommend. So feel free to lean on your local bike shop as well. They'll be there to guide you through the process. If your chain is skipping in between gears, so you shift but it doesn't quite go, that could be a derailleur system problem. What I'm talking about is if the chain ever skips forward, if it skips over the cog, or if you ever feel it lose resistance and then catch resistance, that's when you're talking to wiggle. So how do you clean it? It's a 4-step process. You want to get the grit out, then you want to grease it up, then you want to let it settle through, and then you want to wipe it down again. So we'll start with the chain that I have rusty here, and I'll start with this nice lubrication, which is light lube, and I'm only going to use lubrication on my chain. Some of you might want to use a degreasing agent to get that initial rust off. There's a device, which I don't have here, unfortunately, but there's a device that Pedros makes and Park Tool makes and other companies make, where they actually clamp down over the chain, and they'll go over the chain, and then as you run the chain, it has brushes to get all that salt and sand and grit and stuff off of it, but it's only a solvent. The next step that you're going to have to do is actually apply the lubricant to the chain itself, because if you don't do that, then you're just putting gaps in the chain, and you need that gap to be filled with lubrication. Otherwise, your the inner workings of the chain, if there's a gap inside of the roller and the pin, it's going to fill with moisture. That moisture is going to attract rust. And if you are just degreasing your chain, you're actually going to attract rust over time. And the beauty of a nice thin lubricant, as it drips into the chain, it fills those gaps and it stays in there. And that's actually what you need to do for the rotational system of the chain.
Yeah,
the way that I do it. Yeah.
I was going to add, do you use a toothbrush? Because I usually use a toothbrush to, like, I'll hold the chain and I'll, after I've done that first step, okay. You have it.
Great question.
I use a toothbrush. I don't have a specific brush, but I usually have old toothbrushes, but okay.
Yeah. So that's another way too. I was just going to stick with the rag to make it easy, just for the interest, but you can also go so far as to get a nice little brush like this. And then you can really kind of get at the chain itself. This is really handy as well if you're trying to brush off the cogs as such. if there's sand, if there's grit. So you really need to, do your due diligence of first inspecting where you've got stuff to clean off. And then typically a rag will do it just for me, but I do have this secondary brush as needed as well. To lube the chain, it's a 4-step process. Like I mentioned, the first thing you want to do is kind of wipe off the initial grit. So what I'll do is I'll kind of spin backwards, and I'll try to kind of just like wipe down the initial gunk that's on there. I do this pretty regularly, regardless if I'm going to lubricate it. I'll just kind of wipe down my chain, because if you let the grit sit, it's going to seep through and cause the rust. The very first thing, I like to equate it to kind of like brushing your teeth before going to the dentist. Just kind of wipe off your chain. Wipe off the cogs, anything that's got debris on it that you need to get off. Just kind of do your due diligence. If you have some time, you could spend like literally an hour cleaning off your cogs and your chain, but do it to your best ability. And that's the first step. The second step is to put the lube on the chain itself. I go link by link. So really you just need a single drop. And the idea is to get that drop into where the links meet to let it settle through. See if I can get this here with my good camera angle. Maybe get a little closer here. Maybe get my light going as well. Yeah. So what I'll do is like literally I'll just do one drop for each link. And if you're a type A person, you're just going to go around and just do it that way. Or if you're a type B person, you can kind of spin, just find a nice, let's see if I can get this up, my hand's getting in the way. You find a nice little position, and then you just kind of, the goal is to make sure that every link has one little drop of lube. This is the point where I'm pretty good about making sure that I don't drip too far, but the idea is probably take the time. And maybe it's a 5-minute process to make sure that I've got enough lubrication throughout my whole chain system. And you can see that some of these some of these chain links aren't really flexing very well. So I'm going to make sure to kind of over lubricate, and I'll make sure I don't grease too much. And again, you just need a little bit in there. I could have done a degreasing agent, but that's a step I'm not going to bother with at this point. I'm just going to try to over lube and let the lube do its work. Any questions about that so far, about how to apply it? You only really need it where the links are meeting. You don't need any on the plates, on the sides, on the tops or the bottoms. You really want to get it so it gets to the inside of the chain. And this is absolutely crucial. I'm just going to go ahead and do this for this whole bike. And actually, you can see I'm going to choose back here on this cog. I'm just going to kind of like find a little spot that spins very easily that I don't need to manipulate too much. See if I can get my camera to stay.
We had a question, Galen, about the wear of the back derailleur cog.
Similarly to the front, it wears just the same as the chain wears, the cogs will wear. So you got to pay attention to the shark finning. If it looks like the cogs, the teeth of the cog are really sharp, chances are you're going to want to start to replace it. If you have a multi-gear system, and I'll pull my other bike out in a moment to show you how to get in between some of the gears, that is a little bit more of a concern because there's more movement going on there. So there's more opportunity for friction. But it's the same exact concept of if it starts to look like a fin, you're going to need to replace it. And it's not good enough just to replace the chain. You're going to also need to replace the cogs themselves.
So let's just reinforce that when you usually you change one, you change the other.
Yep,
but
generally.
That's not the case. And the front chain rings don't wear out as much, but definitely you're going to get the wear on the rear derailleur, the rear cog.
And a lot of it too, Lauren, is a lot of how you ride, how you shift, how much power you put into it, how much force you do, and how much cleaning you really go into it. So it's a little bit of a personal preference, but there is a device that bike shops will have that actually measures how much wear a chain has, how much the chain is elongated from link to link. The longer the chain is, the more worn out it is. The more worn out it is, the more worn out the cogs are, because they do wear as a system. And a good bike shop won't sell you a new chain without taking a look at your cogs as well. Right. Putting a new chain on worn out cogs is just going to cause skipping, just going to wear everything down. I go through about maybe a chain every year and a half. I go through new rear cogs maybe every 2 years, and I go through new front cogs maybe every 3 years or so, depending on how hard I ride. And a little of it depends on the quality and the type of metal. Higher qualities last longer, but it's also how much wear and tear from the friction. If I have a rear gear system where my chain is going inboard and outboard, there's more opportunity for friction for the chain to actually wear away little bits of metal.
Now this bike doesn't have the little wheel, so you're going to talk about that too. The little derailleur wheels.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to skip to my cabling system on this bike, and then I'll come back to the chain to talk about that in the end with my other bike, just to kind of get the cogs too. Knowing that I kind of want to wrap up in about 15 or 20 minutes. So the idea there is this is a quick lesson here, but trying to cover the highlights. I'll take a pause here. The way of keeping your bike chain happy, it's a 4-step process. You wipe it down, get the initial crud off. Then you apply lubricant, just like I did there, and I kind of over applied it because this was very rusty. That's the second step, putting the lubrication so it seeps into the chain link. The third step is actually giving it time, letting the chain lube soak through the chain to get coated in the interior. And some people wait overnight, some people wait 15 minutes, some people take a ride and they actually kind of like work the chain around and let the chain do its motion to flush through. But there's got to be time involved because the lubrication actually needs to do its work. That's the third step. And the last step, which is arguably the most important that most people don't do, is wiping it down again. And that's just as easy as you did the first time around, where you kind of clamp the chain with a rag and you kind of spin the pedals and you get the chain to flow and you wipe it down. Anything that you're removing is excess. You only need chain lubricant on the interior of the chain. So if your chain is really greasy to the touch, you need to wipe it down. You only want it on the inside. Thinking about the model here, you only need it where the pins and the rollers and the plates meet. Anything on the exterior will just attract grit. So the fourth step, again, just like the same as the first, is just to do your due diligence of wiping it down. Now, I did not wait the proper time here, so I'm not actually letting my chain lube do what it needs to do. However, I just want to show you what happens when you just use a solvent on a really rusty chain. I'll find a relatively clean spot of the rag, and I'll show you that with a little bit of lubrication and even just 30 seconds, you start to get all that grit. And all that is metal bits along with muck. And that is what you're cleaning off of the chain. That is extra, extra important. I'll show you with my other bike in 2 steps how to work on your derailleur system just the same. Cool. I'll take a quick pause there. That's probably one of the most important things to keep in mind. That's called the drivetrain, and making sure that the drivetrain is lubricated isn't just a springtime thing, isn't just a winter thing. It's something that you need to keep track of. If your chain is skipping or not shifting properly, and it's been a while since you cleaned and lubricated it, do that first, and that might solve your problem. If you're riding in the good season and it's been a particularly rainy week, at the end of the week, clean and lubricate your chain. Or if it starts to sound like you're riding with a family of mice and there's lots of squeaks, clean and lubricate your chain. It's just something that you got to do on the regular. Cool. All righty. Let's talk a little bit about the cabling system. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about this type of cabling system, see if I can get a little closer, where it is a concern because there's an exposed cable that goes into the brake housing, which is right here, and it can slow down when I'm trying to actually hit my brakes. I can feel the friction in the brake line. So I'll show you real quick on some tips on how to mitigate that as you're cleaning your bike. With this, I'll actually use my spray lube. This was my T9 spray. I really appreciate this. This also doubles as chain lubricant, so you can do this for everything if you want. The idea here is, where along your bike system are you able to get at the part of the cabling system and the housing system that is at all exposed? And on this bike, unfortunately, again, I was mentioning it has this little hole right here. So a nifty little trick is basically just to take a little bit of chain lube and just kind of get in there and just do like a little bit of a dab and get at where the housing and the cabling system meet. And I'm doing not a very good job because I'm doing too many things at once with my hands. But the idea is, if you're ever spraying spray lube, try to avoid getting it on your brakes or your rims, but try to do your best to kind of get it to drip down into the cabling system. And you can kind of almost see here there's like a little capillary action that's kind of causing the chain lube to drip its way into the chain, into the cable and housing system. And then I'll pump my brakes a bit at the top here just to kind of work the cable to get it to flow. Just that little bit will allow that lubrication to get itself into that housing system. You can also do it at the top. So up here, you'll see that I have these barrel adjusters that if I were to kind of get it, and I only recommend this if you're familiar with your barrel adjusters, but see if I can do this with only one hand while I'm holding a camera. Very hard in COVID, Lauren, to do everything with AV included. So on a barrel adjuster, like I have here, you'll see that there's a slot that I can line up, that if I find a particular alignment, I can line up my brake handles, my barrel adjuster lock screw, and my barrel adjuster itself. And I can even, if I'm able to, and I might not be able to, I'll show you on my other bike, but I could actually disengage my brake and pull my brake cable out. And then I could apply lubrication inside of the housing via that same model of just a little drip along the cable goes into the housing, and that will open up the brake. This is only for bikes that have this style of side brakes, like a mountain bike style of brakes, not the ones that have the drop bars. I'll demonstrate that in a moment. But take a look on your bike to find out how the cabling system works. This can also be done on shifter cables, but any spot where you've got an exposed element of the cable as it goes into the housing, see if you can find a little corner where you can put a drop or two of lubrication in, and then work it by pumping the handles. And I guarantee you, if you've had a sticky cable system, that's the first step to do to kind of revive it and bring it back to life. And that's super handy because then you can shift easier, shift smoother, and brake easier and brake smoother. Cool. If you've put on lubrication inside of the cabling system, you don't need to wipe it down. If it's inside the system, it's just going to stay there and then do its justice. And again, I recommend doing the spray lube, and I'll show you why with the drop bars in a minute as well. And then lastly, with this bike, before I move on to my other one, I'll get at it with my fizz. So for you, Lauren, you like to use a soap bucket, and which is great, and just kind of wash it down. This exact same thing here. What I can do here is I can just take my green fizz. Again, I like to use this not for the chain or the wheels or the brakes, mainly for the frame, but just kind of getting a good spritz along, and then see if I can get some good, and just kind of wiping it down. And if you've got bits of rust, like I have up here, we got a good question last go around. If you have bits of rust and it start to be a concern, you can get at that with a little bit of steel wool to scrape off that rust. But once you've done that, it's exposed. So you're going to want to coat it in something. I like to use nail polish. You can try to find a color of nail polish that matches the frame. And then you can just put a dab. Once you've removed the rust with a little bit of steel wool, put a little dab of nail polish on to seal it up, and then just keep an eye on it. And that's only a concern if you've got a steel bike. If you have an aluminum bike, it doesn't rust. So even if you've got a chip or two, it's not a big deal. If you have a carbon bike, not a big deal. Although if you have a chip in your carbon bike, get it checked out because carbon doesn't bend, it fails. And if you've got a titanium bike, then you're well above where I'm at. So congratulations, you've made it into the upper echelon of being a bike owner, and your titanium bike will outlast any of us. So no real worries about the rust on there. Typically, this is like if you have a steel bike, keep an eye on the rust there. So again, most sensitive thing, the chain, keep an eye on that and know how it wears, know how it functions, know how to clean it. Secondarily, keep an eye on the cabling systems. And you can do a little spritz, you can do a little dripping of lubes to make sure that the cabling systems are nice and smooth. And then when you're going for the frame or something that's not an exposed component that needs to rotate, something with a little soap in it goes a long way. Green fizz is great. And then with that, I'll move on to another bike to demonstrate a little bit with a mountain bike, and then I'll show you some drop bars. Looking to try to wrap this up in about 10 minutes. Does that sound okay with everybody? Lauren, doing good?
Great.
Cool. And I realize it's a lot of explanation without that much demo, because I think it's just hard to do demo under Zoom circumstances. So hopefully talking you through matches how your bike functions as well. All right. Here's my old Stumpy, which is actually my favorite winter bike. I love this bike. It's great. It's an old stump jumper. The shocks are dead, but that's okay. A little bit of context on this one. You can see that there's a lot of grit. So maybe the first thing that I'll do is take a look at. It doesn't quite matter what order you're doing things in, just as long as you're doing them all. But, you know, if I was going to take my green fizz and do a couple spritzes there, and I can kind of, boom, now it looks like it was 1997 again, like it's brand new. And then you'll see on this bike, there's a lot of exposed cabling, right? This is my shifter cable as it comes down. This is my rear shifter cable. There's a lot of exposed metal, which will rust. And you can see from my front, the cabling system as it comes from here, as it goes down, does have opportunities for drag. Your bike will be different than my bike, so that's just something to pay attention to. I'm going to demonstrate a little bit about brake cleaning on this bike because it's a little bit easier, and then I'll demonstrate the gears as well. So on your bike, hopefully you have a quick release system for your brakes that you're familiar with, where you have a little dial or you have a little hook or something that you can actually disengage your brakes. A lot of folks know how to do that so that when they pull their wheel off, they're able to not maneuver their brakes or mess with their brakes. But if you do disengage your brakes, you need to know how to re-engage your brakes. So before you take out your brakes and deactivate, you should be 100% confident that you know how to put it back on. On this bike, you'll see that there is, it's called a cantilever system for these brakes. The way that the cabling comes in here, I can actually disengage my brakes under this system. See if I can get my camera going up here. And the way that I can actually disengage my brake is to get my hand out of the way. I can take my cable, oops, and kind of come under here. Oops, did I turn off my camera? Sorry, folks. Boom, and we're live. I can take my cable, I can take my system here, and I can unhook my brake, and now my brake is off. Your system is going to be different than mine. You might have a dial on your brake where it just tilts up and down. You might have a quick release system towards a lever. If you don't know where it is, go to your bike shop and they'll show you how to disengage your brakes, but more importantly, they'll show you how to re-engage your brakes. But now that my brake is off, I can take a look at the pad and I can take a look at the rim. And I just have that much more ability here to play around and clean. So this is where my rubbing alcohol is going to come in handy. For this portion, and for any sort of brake cleaning, I don't recommend simple green. I don't recommend any lubrication. I just recommend water and rubbing alcohol. So what I'll do is, and actually I should also mention, I don't have it here and I meant to grab it. You can also get sandpaper. And sandpaper is really nifty because you can start to rough up the rubber on your brake pads to make them tacky again. What I'll do is, see if I can demonstrate here and get my light under there. I'll just take a little bit of rubbing alcohol, find a clean part of the rag, or heck, maybe even grab a new rag because that one is so greasy already. And I went to Bike Month, so I have a ton of these Bike Month t-shirts. A little bit of rubbing alcohol, dab it in. You can kind of go overboard, it's just rubbing alcohol. And this is really good as a solvent, and that's all you really need on the brakes. And I will go and I will start to rub the rims and get that grit off. If you have brakes like I do that are rim brakes, and you can see that grit that came off? That just came off the rim. That means that every time I'm braking, every time I'm activating my brakes, I'm pushing that rubber and pushing that grit into my metal rim and slowly wearing away the rim. And rims actually start to get hollowed out. They start to get concave, which if that's the case, you can lose structural integrity and your rim might fail. I've only in my career had one wheel fail on me. But if your wheel fails, you are done. You are just like, there's no hope. Hopefully it's the rear wheel, crash, but you're walking. There's no way to solve that problem. So you want to make sure that you get enough grit off as regularly as possible. And again, a little bit of rubbing alcohol, boom. And then you just kind of do your due diligence to wipe down the rim, very basic. And then you do the same for the pad, for the brake pad. And this is where all the grit starts to get in there. while you're doing this, if you're able to get at your pad, depending on your quick release, pay attention to the rubber. Some brake pads will have wear lines. It's a little hard to see here, but you can kind of see these little, I don't know if my macro camera is going to do it for you, but there are these little indentations in the pad, which do two things. One, they allow the pad to flex, and they allow the pad to kind of blend, but they also will tell you if those wear lines are down, your pad is done, you need to replace your brake pads. If you don't know how to replace your brake pads, that's what a bike shop's for. Don't worry about it. They're cheap. But the idea there is that they are, like your chain, probably one of the most fragile of the consumable parts. They need to get replaced regularly. So again, rubbing alcohol, rim, rubbing alcohol pads, and get at it. For the rest of the stuff, simple green for the frame, and then lubrication for any of the moving drivetrain parts. While I have you on this bike, let's talk about the gearing and the rear. Let me just move this guy up like so.
Galen, is wiping down the rim important even if you have disc brakes?
Great question. No. Great question. No, it's just the rotor. So the same concept of wiping down the rim to get the debris off the rim for a rim brake, you would do for the rotor of the brake, of a disc brake, just to get that same debris off. Okay. Yep. The beauty of disc brakes are that there is a lot of margin of error at the rim of the brake. You bust a spoke, you can probably still ride no problem and still brake okay because the braking mechanism is at the center of the wheel. However, there's not a lot of margin of error with the rim itself, of the rotor itself. So if the rotor gets bent or if your disc brake gets misaligned, then you have to kind of spend some time fine tuning it. So pros and cons for disc brakes, and my apologies, I wasn't even thinking when I gave up my disc brake bike to the bike shop this week that I wanted to use it for a demo. But the same concept that I would have done of just rubbing alcohol, a clean rag on the rotor, rubbing alcohol, a clean rag on the rim, same principle, same idea. Great question though. And then I should also mention that some bikes that you've got out there are hydraulic system brakes where you don't have a cable, where it's a hydraulic fluid, or maybe it's a cable system with hydraulic fluids. I'm not going to go into the hydraulic fluid fixing. If that's a problem and you have to re-bleed the hydraulic line, I'll point you to a bike shop for that one. Cool. So I'm going to go just a few more minutes on this, and then I'll show you my quick fix about drop bars and how they're different, and then we'll wrap up. So the idea of, once I get my camera set, of having a bunch of gears, Lauren, you probably know this, is that this is what fails most, right? The pulley wheels start to go. This is where it collects all the grit, and you can see from my close-up, ideally, there's a lot of grit here, right? This is just nasty.
That's where I like. That's where I like the toothbrush.
Yeah, this little guy's good. I'll just use a rag, or a piece of cardboard is actually fantastic for this portion too. Don't use metal. Use something that is softer than the component, because you don't want to scrape away or break your component. You'd rather your tool break than your derailleur break. So those of you who like to use knives or butter knives or something like that to clean off your pulley wheel, don't do it. Use a piece of plastic. This is why tire levers are plastic, because the tire lever will break before your rim bends. It's the idea of the tool, in some instances, needs to be weaker than the component. So check this out. All this sorts of grit in there. Typically for the pulley wheels, this is where a lot of that crud collects. What I'll do is, if I have a free flow and I can pedal backwards, I'll just get a good clamp, like right on the pulley wheel, and start to scrape that crud off. So look, see how clean that is right here? If I get a solid part of the pulley wheel and just start to scrape off some of that crap, it's just gross. It's thick, it's gritty. This is just what you need to pay attention to and get that off your derailleur system. If you clean your chain and you don't clean off your pulley wheel, you're only doing half the battle. So what I do is literally just kind of hold it pretty hard, kind of like pinch the pulley wheel with my rag as I'm pedaling backwards to get the pulley wheel to flow. And I don't like to use a degreasing simple green for this. because again, there's so much metal that needs to rotate that I don't want it to get degreased, but that's just me. If you want to degrease it, go for it, spray it down, but then make sure that you put a little bit of grease on afterwards. So I'll do that for my top pulley wheel. See if I can change my camera angle a bit. You'll have 2 pulley wheels, and they collect thick stuff. And I'm like literally using my thumbnail to kind of scrape at this. And I'm sorry it's hard to see while I'm doing it in real time because my rag covers it. Basically, I'm getting down into it and just kind of flicking some of that thicker crud off. And then if I have a thin lubricant, like I've used here, or the T9 is also really thin, sometimes I'll just kind of give it a little extra spray, and I'll be a little cautious. Maybe I'll put a rag behind it so that I can just douse it in there. Because this stuff works as a solvent as well. This is thinner than the grit. This will break apart the grit. And in its place, it leaves lubrication, which is key. You just got to do your due diligence of making sure that you wipe it down afterwards so it's not greasy and shiny.
Someone mentioned WD-40.
Ooh, great. I'm sorry I didn't bring that up earlier. So WD-40, which I do have here, and actually I didn't show you this, and I'm cautious on this. So WD-40 is a solvent only. This is not a lubricant at all. This WD stands for water displacement. So this is really good about getting off rust and unseizing frozen stuff with rust. Like imagine the inside of this chain is totally rusty. WD-40 do a really good job of getting that rust out. However, it doesn't put anything in that place. So once the WD-40 flushes out, this then fills with air and moisture and brings more rust. The WD-40 is only okay if then you follow it up with a lubricant. Now, I used to not recommend WD-40 at all on bikes. However, WD-40 has now made bike-specific products. So you can buy WD-40 lubricant now, which actually isn't WD-40. It's another product. It's just under the brand WD-40, which makes it all confusing because actually I say no WD-40, but then people are like, oh, but I bought a bike lube, WD-40. I'm like, okay, you can use that. But I caution you with WD-40 because this is very harsh, but necessary if you really need it. If you've got some springs or something that are really seized, but it's only half the battle. You then need to get some lube on it as well. Great point. I appreciate that. For the derailleur system, I also like this little spray bottle because there's a set of gears, or a set of springs, I should say. You can kind of almost see it like in the pulleys. See if my camera can show you. You see the springs that are there? Very exposed, very rusty. They're right here. Those are very fragile. And so I'll do my spray T9 and I'll give a good douse in there as well of just getting those springs woken up. I love this stuff. This is like the awakener of a lot of the derailleur system as well. So clean up the pulleys, make sure there's a good amount of lubrication in the rotational systems and the spring systems of the derailleur. If you have a front derailleur with a little bit of a spring, you can kind of find a little hole somewhere in there and give a little dab, just like a little dab or two of the spray stuff goes a long way to wake it up. And then if you've got grit, just like we were cleaning off the pulley wheels, the reason I like, see if I can show you my cassette back here. The reason I like cardboard so much is I can just kind of get in between the teeth and go gear by gear and get that grit out. And that's also where Lauren probably likes to use her toothbrush.
Right.
So again, I'm focusing mostly today on the drivetrain, of the grit, of the crud that you've been riding through. This is the key to spend the time and again, get dirty, get greasy, and get into it. And then just keep in mind that any solvent you put on is not enough. You also have to make sure the lubrication is involved as well. But not everything really needs lubrication. It's really just the springs, a little bit of the pulley wheels, the chain itself, and anything that might be a little bit exposed in the cabling system.
Now, what did you say was the wake up material again? I was taking notes.
Oh, I love this. It's called T9.
Okay.
And I believe it's got, oh gosh, I used to know, a little bit of Teflon in it.
Okay.
So it's actually like really thin, but like very good. It's a lubricant only, but it acts also as a dissolvent of some of that crap that you're really trying to get off.
Okay.
And the last thing I'll show you, in the interest of time, I want to wrap up so I can take a couple questions before we round out at 6, is probably something you're a little bit more familiar with. with a road bike system. So the same things we were talking about in terms of where's the quick release on the brakes, how to clean off the rim, how to clean off the pads, how to clean off the chain, the derailleur systems. Most of that stuff is comparable, what we were looking at, to this. I'll kill this camera here. I'll just keep my one camera. Make this big. Jess, can you just spotlight this one with the handlebars? Make it nice and big for everybody. Thank you. Just like I was talking about finding the little gaps to do the spray of the cabling, one good way, if you're getting really gunky in the shifting and the braking, if you open up by pulling down the brakes, you can kind of get at the system that's inside of here. And what I like to do to wake up my road bike setup is just get into the system, and I'll probably get a rag ready because this will spray quite a bit. I don't want to damage my lovely bar tape. I'll get in there and just do a good dousing of T9 inside of here. And this is for bikes that have index shifting, where it's you shift and it clicks, and that should correlate to shifting of a gear. This will help de-gunk that spring cable mechanism that's inside of there. Same stuff, same T9 spray bottle, just getting it in there every so often. And if you do this, once every month or two, it will make your shifting that much smoother, and it will start to have that, again, that capillary system of the flow of the lubrication will actually start to get into the cabling system. Now, on this bike, you'll see that most of the cabling is enclosed, which is great, but the some parts that are exposed, if I really wanted to, like for instance, I could throw this bike upside down and kind of get at to where the, sorry, it's a little hard to see, but get at to where the cabling system starts to hit the housing, and kind of do the same dropping of the lubrication into the cable to go into the housing and then to make its way through. But the key difference with drop bars is that there's a lot of integration with the shifting and the braking that starts to get gunked up over time. And so just a little bit of dousing in there does a really good job of waking it up. If it hasn't been, used in several months, just been sitting in your garage, that will typically start to wake things up. So that's the only real difference I'd recommend with a road bike that we didn't cover. Again, just to recap, mainly you want to think about lubrication for the moving parts, for the rotational parts, for the metal parts, for the chain, for the springs, for the pulley wheels. You want to think a little bit about the solvents for the rims and the brakes, only for rubbing alcohol. And for the frame and anything else that might have mud and gunk on it, I could easily spend an hour just beautifully wiping down my bike and making it look pretty. And something that's non-abrasive, that's pretty easy. And then, you want to make sure that if you are using a solvent on the parts that need lubrication, that afterwards, once they're dry and clean and wiped down, that you then have the application of lubrication in it. And hopefully your bike's in good condition. And if there's any questions about it, or it's been a while, your local bike shop's there for you. So please bring your bike to a bike shop and they can show you how this all works for you too. But if you get in that practice of this, you can do this in 15, 20 minutes. And you can wake up your bike after several months of not riding. Or if it's been a particularly muddy week, spend your due diligence of wiping down that crud and keep it moving. Cool. Great. And I rounded out just a few minutes early, so I apologize if we don't have too much time for Q&A, but I'm happy to stick around a little bit. And Lauren or Jess, I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Galen. This is really informative. So we're taking lots of notes here. I remind everybody that we're going to send out an email to everybody, hopefully by tomorrow morning. Jeff said he's going to put together a list of all of these items we've been talking about, which would be great. And we are recording this, so that'll be available on YouTube. But yeah, there's been some questions. I think we've answered a lot of them. I see Joy asking, do bike shops do these? Of course, a bike shop will do this. Of course, you pay for it because it's a time-consuming process. But yes, you can always have a bike shop do it. I guess the question I had was real quick. This thorough cleaning you can do. You're not doing it all at once. Sometimes you'll be doing parts of it, right? So that's the idea.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'll do I'll clean my chain and drivetrain more regularly. I'll do the cabling, re-greasing maybe once every season or so if it starts to get sticky. I'll clean off my frame and I'll spray down. Oh, I forgot to mention with the watering can. This is also a really good way to do things. You can just kind of like literally just water your bike. And that gets off a lot of the salt and sand. And then you just kind of wipe it down with a rag. So where Lauren likes to use a hose, as long as it's a low flow, you're doing something like that. But yeah, good question, Lauren. I would say if there's grit and salt on it, just wipe it down regularly, clean the chain, spin a month, take a look at it, try to do it. And then the cabling, it's just whenever it starts to get sticky.
Someone asked if T9 is silicone spray is okay.
Yeah, I think it's the same
Okay.
for the most part.
Okay, great, excellent.
Yeah. The
Anybody
idea there with T9, I should say, is it's thin. You want to get really thin stuff because that's the way it'll kind of work its way into the cabling and the housing system. And you want to get something that is silicone or based too, because it'll last a little bit longer.
Okay, great, excellent. Any other questions out there? Someone said about something about electronic shifters. Good question.
Oh, good question. My suggestion is there's probably an adjuster that has a spring attached to it that you might need to either mess with a screwdriver. They all change depending on the model and the brand. But mostly my experience is the thing that gets with electronic shifting is it's full of grit. So water, clean it off, make sure it's as debris free as possible, and you'll probably, solve your problem that way.
I got a question if WD-40 is like white lightning.
Ooh, good question. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I have a feeling that white lightning is more of a degreasing agent, similarly to this solvent you can see, but I'm not 100% sure. So I might have to Google that and follow up with you.
And the T9 is a spray or it's a squeeze bottle?
You can get the squeeze. I have it here as the spray because I like to have the hose that allows me to get kind of in the derailleur springs, and I can be very targeted about where I'm at.
Okay, great.
Oh, white lightning is a lube. Okay, cool. So white lightning is probably similar to this rock and roll, I would imagine. There's different brands. We have Pedros, rock and roll, and white lightning apparently is a lube as well.
Great.
Yeah. And, make sure it's bike specific is the other thing too, is that, if you're out there, you want to make sure that it's made for bike componentry. Motor oil will not do. Okay. Olive oil will not do.
Although I had mentioned in Italy when I first went there, they used to clean bikes with a mixture of gas and lube. Like I don't. Oh
yeah.
Yeah.
Just and I think the beauty with that, Lauren, is the gas evaporates. So that's the whole point of the rubbing alcohol too. It doesn't leave a residue.
Okay.
So it'll just kind of get that crap out of there.
Great. Excellent. Let's see. Any other questions there? Just bring them on in. And for those of you who are beginning to leave, thank you so much. And you can stay around. But again, thank you so much. We're going to send up a follow-up. We have these shows every Friday, so stay tuned. We're going to have some more bike related ones. And, of course, everyone be safe. Another thing you please adjust, everybody, before you start cycling again is your helmet. Make sure that we can keep your bike in shape, but we want you to keep your head in shape too. So make sure your helmet's nice and snug. And another thing about helmets people don't usually realize is that your helmet loosens over time. So you usually have to tighten it at least once a month. So anyway, we just want you guys to be safe out there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, we didn't talk about the road safety stuff, which is also MassBike's wheelhouse. So if you have any questions about road safety, laws, regulations, we're here for you.
Okay, we'll do this again. This is really great. We'll do another session. And when we email you folks, please give us feedback. What kind of things you'd like to hear about. We could do another MassBike session for sure. Like I said, we're doing these every Friday and they're really getting a lot of, it's been really great. So, and it's been nice to see everybody. So, thank you all for coming. And I'll hang out here a little bit more for another 5 minutes. But if you're taking off, we'll see you again soon. We'll see you out there on the road. And there's a lot of also local bike groups. Okay. So if you're local in the Massachusetts area, there's lots of Facebook groups that are also talking about road conditions and talking about rides. So there's lots of resources. Galen's a great resource. Jeff is a great resource, Jess too, and myself. So let us be your local resources at least for riding and so forth. So,
Excellent.
and there's a women's ride this weekend. Yeah, this weekend is women's International Day. So there's an international ride this weekend, which is a little early side, but a lot of people are going to be doing that. So we miss seeing you at all these cycling events. Let's hope things start changing soon. We can do all this in person.
Yeah, Lauren, thank you so much for having us too. We're really appreciative of the collaboration with Ciclismo. So,
of course, thank you. This is really interesting. I mean, it really is something I really enjoy doing. I mean, it's a very nice process. So we, yeah, I look forward to well, it's a little cold. I'm a little bit struggling with right now because I don't have a space like you do. So I'm going to probably just work on the drivetrain right now because I don't really have a place to do the whole bike. And my bike is pretty messy. So I'm feeling like I better go out and clean it this weekend.
Cool.
Great.
Cool. Well, let us know how it goes. I look forward to riding together soon.
Thank you. Okay. Well, listen, goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Ciao, Galen. Bye, Jess.
Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Take care. Ciao, ciao.